That was introduced in Frankfurt in response to the death of a UK student amid a hazing incident is now law. Lofton's law was signed by Governor Andy Beshear today.
It's named after Lofton Hazelwood, who died in October of 2021. The law makes hazing that leads to death a felony. WKYT's Phil Pendleton has more from the state capitol.
18-year-old Lofton Hazelwood died in October of 2021. He was found at the farmhouse fraternity. His cause of death was listed as alcohol toxicity. Numerous investigations pointed to hazing, including the use of alcohol at the farmhouse fraternity. Lofton's parents began a campaign that actually started with a mock law at a school that grew into an actual law that was signed by Governor Beshear Monday.
His future was bright, but tragically, his life was cut short because of hazing, causing his parents, loved ones, and so many others to experience the heartbreak and pain of his passing.
Senate Bill 9 will make hazing that leads to death or serious physical injury a felony. Reckless participation in hazing can result in a Class A misdemeanor.
Well, I hope that everybody thinks twice about before they try to do something like that again. You know, it's supposed to be a brotherhood. There's nothing about hazing that says brotherhood at all.
Hazelwood's mother says that she wants to do a whole lot more. She says despite the fact that this bill is passed, there is more work to do. There is more education about the dangers of hazing. Some of that includes speaking with high school students. In Frankfurt, Phil Pendleton, WKYT.
And the governor also mentioned the scholarship that was named in Hazelwood's honor, which will be open to people from his hometown of Henderson who have an agriculture major to enter a trade school.